Friends, very good to see you. Thank you for joining us. James, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Ian. It's very great to be here.
I thought you were going to say to see you nice. You haven't done that for a while.
Do you know, it went through my mind to say to see you nice, and I resisted the temptation.
Very good. The only solution to temptation is to give in to it, then it won't trouble you anymore. No, that's not right, is it? Sorry, no.
We shouldn't be, yeah.
No, okay, let's not go there. Well, welcome, friends, to episode number 117.
Yeah, now 117. You're bound to want to tell me something about that number, Ian. So
well, it's not prime.
No, which is interesting, isn't it? Because it kind of looks as though it might be to begin with.
Yeah, but the digits add up to a multiple of 3 and a 9, so they're going to be a factor. Chinese dragons are usually depicted having 117 scales.
Yeah, that's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, all to do with yin and yang. And in Denmark, apparently, 117 means a very large number. So where we say thousands and thousands, apparently they say 117.
Yeah.
So, friends, I hope it doesn't feel like we've been doing thousands and thousands of these videos, but thank you for sticking with us all the way through. So,
yes, especially to our Danish viewers.
Yeah, indeed, absolutely. We should learn some Danish. So, James, where are we on the lectionary, and what passage are we looking at?
Yeah, so we're Trinity 19, so we're tanking it towards the end of the Trinity season, and we're Mark 10, verses 2 to 16, which is a little bit interesting because it's continuous from last week, except for the fact that we've missed out the first verse. Why the lectionary does that, who knows? But apparently that's not deemed of sufficient interest.
But because the lectionary is advisory, then we don't have to stick to it.
Stick to that. No, so you always read an extra verse or two if it puts the context, makes the context a bit easier for us. But actually, I mean, this is really. This is a passage it's not in two halves, but it got two subjects, divorce and then the children. And I mean, I think it's a passage where the context is, well, it's everything really, isn't it? It's hugely important because it's such a difficult passage.
It is really. Now let's just stick with verse 1, which is not in the lectionary.
Yeah.
It is interesting. Because this signals he's really very much embedded in the Judean context now. He left there.
Yeah.
And he went to the regions of Judea and beyond the Jordan. So just the other side of the river. The crowds gathered to him. Of course, this is reminding us of the ministry of John the Baptist and crowds gathering to him as well. And this is a fascinating phrase from Mark's gospel. As was his custom, he taught them. So, Mark's gospel, very much Jesus is the teacher, isn't he?
Yes, absolutely. Though interestingly, he doesn't contain a lot of Jesus' teaching, but he does emphasize
the teaching.
Jesus, the teacher. Yeah. So it's not like Matthew in a sense, great blocks of teaching. Yeah. But it's very important. It's very important for Mark, the role that Jesus plays, I think. Yeah. But of course, he is teaching here.
And he is in this section. I guess it's worth just noticing that when we get into this passage, there are some big issues. There are big issues in the text. There are big issues theologically. There's big issues pastorally as well. I was quite struck by the fact that the passage starts off by saying the Pharisees came up and in order to test him asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And so it just felt to me there's an indication here that the Pharisees are less focused on, as it were, the pastoral concerns and pastoral implications, and they're more focused on proving something or having an argument. That just really sets up a warning for me, because I think if we're speaking about this in any context at all, we're certainly for preaching on a Sunday, there are going to be people in the congregation sitting in front of us who are deeply affected by this question personally for all sorts of reasons. I was really taken back by someone in my congregation, I remember last year, talking about this issue in general and saying that she still bore the stigma of having married young, divorced quickly, then remarried, and then had a long, fruitful relationship with her current husband. But she still could remember 50 years ago, the stigma of having been divorced, in that time.
Yeah.
So these things run deep.
They do. They really do, don't they? And it's really interesting that I think most people who hear this passage in a church on a Sunday morning will hear it pastorally. There will be a pastoral filtering thing that goes on, which means that the preacher's got to navigate that. And yet, as you say, it feels very much like the Pharisees. I mean, it's a bit like their question about, the taxes to Caesar, the coin and taxes to Caesar.
Yeah.
That it's one of those testing questions where they're seeking actually really to trip Jesus up.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe to clarify what he thinks, but they're really kind of wanting to trip him up. So that gives a quite different feel to the passage. But of course, that's not to say the passage does not have pastoral implications. It does, but they need to be navigated carefully.
Yes, they do. And I think the moment we get into the passage, the moment we get into their first question, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Two things leap out for me. One is that you've got the obvious difference with Matthew, and this is where I've got my Throckmorton, my gospel parallels, and you can see that very clearly. The order of material is slightly different, but also there are two key differences in the text between Mark and Matthew. And the first one is that where the Pharisees here say, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Interesting that Matthew gives us a gloss on this. I think this gives us a clue into the second issue, which is about reading it in context. So Matthew says, in Matthew's version, the Pharisees say, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? Yeah. And that really does open the window for us to say, hang on, there's a context here. Jesus isn't speaking sort of de novo into this. No. There's actually an ongoing debate, and the Pharisees are dragging Jesus into it, aren't they?
Yes, and this is, of course, Matthew 19 is where it comes in Matthew. Yeah. And the key thing here is, which I think I've been really, really helped by David Instone-Brewer's work on this, which we'll probably talk about a little bit today, where he works he helps to explain that the idea of an any matter divorce was the concept that was being argued about between Pharisees of various different flavors, as it were. I mean, Hillelites, Shammaites, and so Jesus being asked to kind of give a ruling in favor of one kind of Pharisee or another. But that any matter divorce was a subject of very considerable discourse at this stage in the first century, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Now we ought to pause there and just dig into that. I mean, a couple of places. I know you've got David Instone-Brewer's Grove booklet there. Great talk on death. I don't know if you there we go.
C19, if anybody's interested. Yeah.
And he's written a longer book on it as well.
He has.
And also a volume that I contribute to too on reading Mark in context, where he has a chapter on that, which is also very, very helpful actually as well. And we just need to set out, it's really interesting, isn't it, that the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai, which came to be two dominant rival schools. And interestingly, Hillel was, I guess we might characterize as sort of the more liberal, and Shammai was the more sort of conservative or more hard line. But it is interesting that on other issues, Jesus sounds more like a Hillelite.
Yes.
On this issue, he's very much a Shammaiite.
Yes.
And so that itself raises a question which I think we want to return to. But we ought to just note that the debate was really about the interpretation. This is fascinating. You wouldn't realize this from the passage, but the debate that they're dragging Jesus into isn't about Genesis. It's actually about Deuteronomy 24.
Yeah.
And I just got a little quotation here from David Instone-Brewer's chapter on reading Mark in context, which it might be worth just sharing. So here it is. So this is a quotation from the Mishnah, and it says, the school of Shammai say, a man should not divorce his wife except that he found in her a thing of indecency, as it is said, for he finds in her an indecent thing, Deuteronomy 24 verse 1. Now that sounds straightforward, but what they understood by that is that the only grounds for the man to divorce his wife was that she's committed an act of sexual immorality.
Yes.
That's the thing of indecency. And the school of Hillel say, even if he spoiled her dish, since it says, for he finds in her an indecent thing. Now, this will be puzzling to most people, I think, because they've quoted the same verse and it looks like the same thing, but actually
they're reading it differently.
They are reading it differently. And the reason is the Hebrew is slightly ambiguous. And so the Hillelites are reading it as saying, for he finds in her an indecency or a thing, which they took to mean either sexual immorality or some other way in which the man was unhappy with her.
Yes.
Now, and what I find really interesting is that this is a debate that is hinging on a technical issue around reading a regulation in Hebrew in Deuteronomy 24.
Yeah.
And then it's fascinating in that context to see what Jesus' response is.
Isn't it just? Yeah. And I think it's really interesting, isn't it? That originally, I mean, as soon as he hears the question from the Pharisees, he immediately goes to the law of Moses, doesn't he? He says, "Well, what does Moses say?" I mean, that's where he starts, and they say, "Well, that's all fine."
Yeah.
But Jesus then responds, "Well, that's actually." What Mark does actually is he presents Jesus as the new Moses, but of course much more than the new Moses. And we've seen this actually. He's authoritative, and we've seen this consistently through the gospel. Actually, I think we've observed it in several videos where, and once again, right here, in a sense, Jesus is challenging the Mosaic or the interpretation of the Mosaic law, and actually settling it, seeking to settle the matter. Yeah.
And instead of delving into their debate about Deuteronomy 24:1, it's fascinating that he then goes back and says, well, hang on a second, it's all very well looking at the minutiae of how the allowances, the provisions have been worked out, but actually we need to get our understanding of marriage right first. And I think it's really interesting that he, again, I've only noticed this. I think somebody pointed out to me recently, a few months ago, was that I just sort of thought, oh, well, he goes back to the creation account. But what's interesting is he doesn't just go back to the second creation account, the Genesis 2 creation account, which you might say is the one relevant about marriage, because you have this etiology of marriage in the story of the creation of Eve. But he actually does a double move because he goes back first to the first creation account.
The creation of male and female. Yeah.
So it's because God created humanity male and female. Then the second creation account says, and therefore this is why marriage is part of God's creation ordinance, and therefore that's the foundation. So he says, look, it's all very well regulating marriage when it goes wrong, but what we need to do is actually get our understanding of marriage right first.
Yes, and James Edwards in his commentary has a nice way of putting this. He says, Jesus endeavours to recover God's will for marriage, not to argue about possible exceptions to it. So he doesn't. It's quite interesting. He doesn't allow himself to be drawn into the argument the Pharisees are putting to him. He changes the grounds on which his conclusion is based, and that is often a classic move by Jesus, isn't it? He cuts through the minutiae to the fundamental principle, and we need to observe that here. Yeah.
But I think also one of the things then that follows on from that is I think and the reason why this text is so hard for many people and why the issue is so demanding is because when it hasn't been read in that context of the debate between Hillel and Shammai, what we end up with, what we take away from this passage is this absolute prohibition. Now, and even some people will say Jesus gives an absolute prohibition in Mark but doesn't in Matthew, and that Matthew and Mark are doing funny things with it. Well, I kind of want to say, hang on a second, let's just not yet make the presumption that these two accounts are incompatible, but actually that Mark is giving us a summary and Matthew's teasing out the detail a little bit more, because both of them are in this historical context. And I think there's two things for me which are really important. One is that in the ancient world, the word divorce, actually, there's no technical term for divorce. No. The word is just to put away or to let go. Divorce only ever meant divorce and with the possibility of remarrying.
Remarry, exactly.
Because if people couldn't remarry, the divorce was meaningless.
Yes. So it's not as it is in our context, where it simply means the legal separation.
Yeah.
It's because and of course that's really important in the ancient world, because one's well-being depended on it. Food, the supply of food, or whatever, the well-being of one's children, all those things were much more marginal than they are in our context. Yes. So that's absolutely vital for the well-being of society.
And they particularly had an impact on women.
Yeah, absolutely.
And therefore, the certificate of divorce that Moses gave meant that if the relationship did break down, at least the woman could prove that she had a right to remarry.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's protection. But I think, again, the second element of this is the fact that if we're right in locating this debate in the context of the discussion the debate between Hillel and Shammai, both of them allowed divorce. Neither of them were absolutists on this.
No.
So, but Hillel said, well, actually, there was a power balance, a shift, because with the teaching of Hillel, men had more power and had freedom to divorce women on any grounds, which shifted away from the much more equal access to divorce, which we actually find in the Old Testament texts.
Yeah.
And Shammai was actually holding to that. So it's really, it makes such a huge difference when we read Jesus' teaching here in that context.
Yes. And in that respect, the passage in Matthew 19 is really, really helpful. It's one of these situations where, as you said earlier, really the parallels, reading parallels gospel
Together.
is really, really helpful. Yeah.
Because when you read Matthew's account, you say, "Oh yeah, well, it's as if Matthew is wanting to make the context more explicit."
Yeah.
Now, I don't know. There's a debate about that. I mean, I've suggested before on the blog. Well, an explanation for that might be that Mark was written before 70, before the destruction of Jerusalem, because the Shammaites were more strict, they sided with the Zealots and the rebels, and they were destroyed by the Romans.
Yeah.
And it was the Hillelite view which actually then went into what became rabbinical Judaism.
Yes.
So if Mark was an earlier text and if Matthew was a later text, that would explain why Matthew makes the context more explicit.
Yeah.
But even if Matthew was early, that doesn't invalidate.
No, it doesn't. Because Matthew's, we generally accept that Matthew's writing for a Jewish audience, so they would have understood.
Yeah,
they'd have got the detail that he gives as well. It makes sense.
Yeah. The other thing that I think David Instone-Brewer really helpfully points out is the fact that until you bring the Hillelite view on board, you have got this parity in the sense that men have grounds on which they can divorce their wives, but women have grounds on which they can divorce their husbands.
Yeah.
And actually we see that evidenced in contemporary Jewish marriage contracts. So just worth sharing that quotation again from him. So again, this is from the book Reading Mark in Context.
Yeah.
According to the law, this is from a marriage contract, according to the law of Moses and the Judeans, and I will feed you and clothe you, and I will bring you into my house by means of your kutavah, the contract, and I owe you a sum of 400 denarii, together with the due amount of your food and your clothes and your bed. Now, that might sound a little bit functional, but again, in context, it's actually rather important that the woman has a guarantee that the husband, who's going to be the primary breadwinner if she is the childbearer, she's actually got security and provision. So it's just fascinating to see that window into the world, isn't it?
It is, and of course, Jewish marriage contracts were pretty mundane. I mean, they were very clear about these matters, and that was really important to protect the wife. So that promise of provision was fundamental.
Yeah. Now, this touches on one of the questions we raised at the beginning, because I mentioned that very often we see Jesus saying that he refutes legalism and puts people back at the center of it. And actually, realizing this context and the impact of this has helped me to see Jesus' teaching here in that way, because what he is doing is restoring the balance of power, it seems to me, by siding with Shammai, whereas the Hillel pushed the balance out of kilter. And I think it's doubly difficult then that Jesus' teaching here has actually pushed the whole approach until the last sort of 50 years or so, pushed the attitude to marriage in the other way, in a way which I think many people would have said was to the disadvantage of women.
Yeah, I think that's true. And when we come on to the later verses, in verses 10 to 12, it is, I think, there's a much more even sharing of responsibility in marriage, both by man and woman, which is actually quite distinct from rabbinical teaching at the time. So he gives both parties moral agency, I suppose you would say. That's probably how we would express it today. Which is interesting.
And Edwards draws this out in his commentary, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. He does a bit, and that's he says. Well, this is what he says. It's he says verse 10, verse 11, where Jesus says, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her." and if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. He says it's a startling declaration because in rabbinic understanding, a husband's adultery was reckoned against a woman's father or husband, not against the woman herself. Jesus' declaration, however, imputes to women the status of sovereign moral agents. So that's a really interesting, really interesting dimension.
It is. Now, some people will challenge us and say, hang on a second, aren't you just imposing a modern liberal egalitarian position on this text? When there's been a long history of people not reading in this way. The other thing people have said to me is, well, what you're doing is you're making this imagined context of debate, you're actually making the text mean something different from the plain reading of the text.
Yes, but I mean, we cannot read Scripture apart from its context, can we? And so whenever we read Scripture, we have to do the task of history, which is to understand what is actually going on. Because, we often say a text without a context is a pretext.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes what people mean by the plain meaning of Scripture is, just
the text ripped out of its context.
Exactly, completely ripped out of it. Leave the context aside. We can't be bothered with that because actually, and often I think there's a sense I get from people who say that sort of thing to me is that they don't actually want to do the hard work of history because history's it's not always straightforward and it takes a bit more than simply reading the Bible and saying, oh well, I think it means this. So you've got to do history. We've been doing history and context on every video, haven't we? All 117.
We have.
That is the historical critical method of which you and I are the inheritors. So
we need to do it here as well.
Yeah.
I think there's another key point. I don't know how much time we got to delve into this one, but again, the other way that this text has been read, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother, and the two shall become one. They are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined, let not man separate. Now, again, there's a fascinating question here that within the history of Christian thinking about marriage, this has, particularly in the Roman Catholic Church, this is the foundation for what we call indissolubility of marriage. But I would note that Jesus doesn't say what God has joined together, man cannot separate. He says what God has joined together, we should not separate. Let not man separate. So even that phrase concedes that a separation is possible. I think the other thing that pastorally I'd notice is that unhealthy marriages are the ones where the individuality of the partners disappears and becomes subsumed into this new one thing called the marriage unit. As if we don't still have distinctiveness and separate interests and needs and so on. I mean, one of the disasters in marriages is where you look for all your needs to be met by your partner, as if you no longer had any relationships outside or no other.
Yes, and that's not healthy. That's not thriving, is it? That's not what marriage is about.
Well, the other historical thing is that actually Christians have a long way back actually believed that marriage was not indissoluble. Cranmer himself actually wanted to include a right of divorce and remarriage, but he was actually overruled. So you can actually find it. And so the belief, the challenge to the claims of indissolubility, go back a long way. And again, we notice historically how indissolubility of marriage has very often played into the hands of giving the power to the male partner.
It is a power play so often. And it's interesting, isn't it, that Paul himself, of course, by background a Shammaiite Pharisee, he quite clearly understands that divorce is possible.
Yes, he discusses it in 1 Corinthians 7, and
exactly. So, and of course, Paul, of course, is also interpreting Jesus here. But there's this idea of indissolubility is just it's a bit of a dog whistle, really, isn't it? In some ways. I think
I can see why it's a response to, and particularly in some social contexts, it's less the case in Britain. It's more the case in the States, I think, where when someone's on their sort of fourth marriage, you kind of think, are we taking marriage seriously here? So there's a pastoral question of how do we steer that route between Jesus saying, look, here's the seriousness of the marriage commitment.
Yes.
And this is about God's creation intention. And when marriages break down, this is a serious thing, and it has really deep, serious consequences for both parties. On the one hand, on the other hand, saying this is not the unforgivable sin, which I think has been communicated in the recent past.
And that has to inform our pastoral practice, doesn't it? We want to absolutely, as the people of God, support and encourage healthy marriage, but we also want to pastorally help and support those whose marriages do end in divorce. And getting that right, doing both, it seems to me, what the teaching of Jesus demands of us.
And I think, therefore, it means being astute about our culture. What are the pressures in our culture which are actually making lifelong, faithful marriages difficult? And I think one of them is consumerism, and the fact that we now assume that every couple has to have a double income.
Yes.
And I think that puts huge pressure on relationships.
Yes, but just like we need to read the scriptures in the context, we need to read our cultural context as well, don't we? And notice what is the time, what is happening in our time. Yeah.
Well, some big questions there. We really have, once we've scraped the surface on that. In the last couple of minutes, we've actually got a couple more verses here, which seem to be rather detached. We go on in verse 13, and they were bringing children to him, they might touch them. And there's some language here, which we saw the week before last, again, about Jesus and children. He saw the children, he brought them, and he brings them into the corner of his arm. He doesn't just lay his hands on the children. He actually brings them and embraces them, we think is actually a better translation. He ankyloses them with the crook of his elbow in them. So, which does seem slightly detached from divorce, but it says something really important about Jesus and children and accepting the kingdom like a child.
Yes, absolutely. And it's really interesting at the beginning of this little passage in verse 13 that the disciples appear to treat children in the same way that they treated the exorcists last week. Which you remember we talked about how very similar attitude. This we don't like this exorcist because he's not doing it in Jesus' name. We don't like these children. So and what's really, I think the parallel here is that the disciples' attitudes are being forged by the culture around them rather than by the teaching of Jesus. And each time that has to be reshaped by Jesus himself. And it's quite strong. The language is actually quite strong in 14. Jesus says he was indignant. Well, that's a really interesting word there, because it's kind of really about venting one's anger. I mean, it's a powerful word. And
Mark has done this before. He's portrayed Jesus as angry. When the man, early on in chapter 1, I think, man comes to him, and Jesus is indignant with this man's illness.
So we do get that in Mark, these strong emotions, as it were, from Jesus. And he says, "Let the children come to me; do not stop them, for it's to such as these that the kingdom of God belongs." That's a really big question, isn't it? What is it about children that, because children, of course, in the ancient world had no status. I mean, you were kind of waiting to become an adult when you turned 13. I mean, you had you weren't accountable. You had no legal status. Everything that you were derived from your father.
And again, there's a danger that we put our culture onto the text rather than reading it in its context, because for us, children are either cute or they're innocent or they're, So we have this image of children having these virtues. Actually, I mean, if you go on the school playground, actually, children can be really vicious. But anyway, there's this idea. We have this idea that children have all these virtues, and the danger is we read this text saying, "Oh, as long as we have these virtues of being innocent and being cute, then we can enter the kingdom." But of course, he's not saying that. He's saying the opposite, which is that you have no virtues, you have no rights, and it's on those terms that we actually enter the kingdom.
Yes, it's our powerlessness, it's our helplessness that becomes the key to entering into the kingdom. And of course, for an adult, it's about our own understanding of that before God, isn't it? That we have no power in ourselves to help ourselves. Only through coming to Christ and can we enter the kingdom itself. So
we receive the kingdom as a gift. Actually, one of the things that children are very, very good at is receiving gifts.
Yes, absolutely. And that's another, And then, of course, at the end, he says he took them up in his arms, laid his hands on them, and blessed them. I think that's fascinating in contrast to what people are doing. He bring children so that he might touch them. But of course, what they get is this, as you were saying, this full embrace and blessing and taking them up in his arms. So it's a rather nice little piece, but really deeply challenging for the disciples. Yeah.
Gosh, James, so many interesting things there. Thank you so much for exploring them with me. Friends, thank you for joining us. Now, James, we forgot to say that there's all sorts of things, 4 things particularly we love people to do.
Yes. We'd love you to click like on the videos. We'd love you to subscribe to the channel. We'd love you to share on your socials.
Just click on the link and you've got the link and you can post it anywhere. And
we'd love you to comment wherever you find the video, where you see it. Do comment on it. And I mean, this one I'm sure will elicit many comments. It's a challenging passage, isn't it? And we need to work together to understand it. So, yeah.
So thank you very much, friends. Thank you for joining us. James, thank you for joining me for episode 117. And friends, we look forward to seeing you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.